and we're going to get started here. Again, welcome everyone. We still have some people filing into the webinar, it looks like. Good afternoon or evening from wherever you're calling from. My name is Spencer Ruckty. I'm the author events manager here at Third Place Books in Seattle, Washington. Now celebrating its 25th year in business, if you can believe it. And on behalf of Third Place Books, I am really pleased to welcome Adam Rowe and Jared Pechaček, who are here to talk about Adam's magnificent book, Worlds Beyond Time, Sci-Fi Art of the 1970s, which is something Adam's a little bit famous for covering. If you haven't seen this book in person, you really should go to your local bookstore and check it out. Thank you again for watching today. To those of you out there, feel free to say hello in the chat and let us know where you're calling in from. Third Place Books hosts well over 200 author events a year, mostly in person these days, but we do love opening up Zoom for both international authors and authors unable to travel in person. Our upcoming author event season features such authors as Ross Gay, James McBride, Naomi Alderman, and sci-fi legend Martha Wells coming to Seattle. You can sign up for our email newsletter at thirdplacebooks.com, where we bring you the latest author news right to your inbox. As mentioned, that chat window is open. I love seeing people use it. During the last 15 minutes or so, we will also have time for your questions. So if you have questions for our panelists this afternoon, please submit those to the Q&A window below, which is separate from the chat window at the bottom of your screen. And a reminder that this event will be recorded. So if you miss anything, we'll be emailing that recording to everyone who registered for the event. And of course, Worlds Beyond Time is available at your local neighborhood independent bookstore. This is, again, a book that must be seen live and in person to believe. So come check it out. We have stacks on the front tables, and every purchase you make supports the future of this author series. So thank you. And now I am pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. Adam Rowe is a senior writer at tech.co and a Forbes contributor on publishing in the business of storytelling. He's also written for IO9, Popular Mechanics, 4.com, and the Barnes & Noble Sci-Fi and Fantasy blog. In 2018, he was a Digital Book World Award nominee for Publishing Commentator of the Year. Rowe curates the popular multi-platform 70s sci-fi art feed, bringing the best in retro sci-fi art to over 100,000 Instagram followers at 70s Sci-Fi, which is, of course, the impetus for this book. And Adam is very fortunate to live here in Seattle, Washington. Joining him in conversation for part of this presentation is Jared Pechaček, an artist and writer based in Seattle, Washington as well. He is the author of the forthcoming fantasy novel from Tor.com, The West Passage, and he is also host of a Tolkien podcast, By the Bywater. And when he's not doing any of that, he is cooking, baking, and sewing something to wear to the opera. Worlds Beyond Time is a visual history of these spaceships, alien landscapes, cryptozoology, and imagined industrial machinery of 1970s paperback sci-fi art. We get a ton of these books here at our Lake Forest Park store and used. We have a whole rack basically dedicated to these wonderfully designed books from the past. And here to nerd out with us, I would love to have you all please welcome Adam and Jared to your screens. Let's hear from them now.
Thank you so much.
Hello.
It's very kind. Yeah, I'm Adam Rowe, and I wrote a big old art book about 70s sci-fi art because I feel this era of art isn't appreciated or understood enough. In the early 70s, sci-fi art took a big leap forward. It was more detailed, more colorful, imagination and scientific research working together in art that was just weird in the past decades. This was especially noticeable in book covers, and the influence can still be seen today in popular science fiction, such as Star Wars, Dune, Marvel, and so many modern sci-fi video games. But this is also living history. I spoke with several of the artists profiled in Worlds Beyond Time, and some are still working in the industry today. In this presentation, I'm going to profile some really interesting artists. I can obviously only cover a handful of stories and artists in the time we have, but Worlds Beyond Time features hundreds more art pieces and dozens more artists. So I hope this presentation will make you curious about this era. I've been collecting and staring at thousands of 70s sci-fi artworks for a decade now. And it's changed the way I see sci-fi art around me. So when I go in a used bookstore, I look at a movie poster, I can recognize the art style of an artist or influences behind the work. Hopefully, after this presentation, You'll be able to identify 70s sci-fi art styles in popular culture all around you. Figure out the screen sharing. Got a whole presentation that works. Share the screen. There we go. Let's get started. In the early 1970s, many different elements came together to create a thriving, innovative, detailed work of paperback and sci-fi, paperback and hardcover art in the sci-fi genre. This is a genre that gave us stuff like space cats, artfully naked saran-wrapped men in space, or space cats. And whatever's going on here in this alien world Bruce Pennington illustrated from 1977, which we were able to use a little zoomed in portion of as the cover for Worlds Beyond Time. But to understand sci-fi in the 70s, we have to talk about how pulp fiction evolved in the decades earlier. Before paperbacks, science fiction as a print genre wasn't books or novels, it was short stories and magazines. Novels did exist. Mary Shelley, H.G. Wells, Jules Verne are all classic sci-fi authors, but the community and the industry for science fiction in the early decades of the 20th century was all about short fiction in magazines. Some of these were pulps, which we have some examples of here. These had the same dimensions as a National Geographic with the same square-bound spines, but they were made with cheap wood pulp pages designed to be disposable. Thanks to World War II paper shortages, another format eventually took over, the digest. It was shorter and thicker, think the size of a Reader's Digest. Cover art from this period was bold, with a focus on adventure over science. You could see a lot of repetition of ideas on these covers. Monsters, silver, rocket-shaped spaceships, and women who were often in peril and yet rarely clad in the bulky spacesuits that the male heroes would get. One artist went beyond these tropes, Frank R. Paul. He broke the mold in the 1930s and 40s. His day job was architectural drafting, and he brought that practical approach to envisioning lived-in worlds with physics and cause and effect. The artist Frank Kelly Freas has called Paul the first illustrator to realize there was a difference between science fiction and mere fantasy. I read a lot of other art books in preparation for Worlds Beyond Time, and in one of them, I came across a quote from the author Arthur C. Clarke, pointing out that in this pulp cover from 1928, Paul put turbulence across the equatorial belt of Jupiter, a detail that Clarke is reasonably certain wasn't known to exist until the Voyager missions almost half a century later. I don't know if Clarke was actually right about that, but either way, it's an example of how Paul actually thought about the science alongside the fiction. The art quality lacks the detail and energy that would come in the 70s, but Paul codified important iconography, stuff like underwater explorers, human-eating plants, future Ice Age apocalypses, dinosaurs fighting laser rays, and a trope you're already familiar with, space cats. This all became the foundation for the visual language of science fiction in the decades to come, and inspired iconic authors such as Isaac Asimov and Ray Bradbury. Bradbury was just 8 years old when he first saw Frank R. Paul's work. Paul wasn't on his own, though. Other artists contributed to the trends that would flourish in the 70s. Virgil Finlay's stipples and cross-hatching brought a variety of textures to black and white interior art. Jack Gaughan stood out for vibrant primary colors on these stylized 1950s and early 1960s covers. And the fast, dependable Ed Emshwiller brought a sense of humor. Both Jack Gaughan and Ed Emshwiller were still working in the 70s, and I cover more of their work in Worlds Beyond Time. At the same time that pulpy adventure art dominated fiction magazines, an artist with a new, more realistic style was making an impact on nonfiction magazines. Chesley Bonestell was an astronomical artist who illustrated for Collier's Life magazine. This here is one example of his work, Saturn as Seen from Mimas in 1943. You can see the amount of detail, attention to the shadow, the depth, There's some tiny explorers there if you zoom in. I really love tiny little explorers. And because what he's illustrating is a real place, he incorporated a lot of what we knew at the time about the landscape or the atmosphere of Saturn in this case. Here's a fun set of his illustrations. He's depicting a series of potential apocalypses for Coronet magazine in 1947. In the first one here on the left, the sun's expansion is boiling off Lake Michigan. The second one shows the gravity from a white dwarf star pulling up everything on Earth. And in the third, the Rio de Janeiro is freezing over after a dark star kidnaps Earth away from the sun. This Chesley Bonestell was first published in 1948 in an issue of Pick magazine. The scene is a fictional alien planet 3 billion miles away from the red supergiant Antares, which you can see on the horizon there. The fine detail here and the striking colors would fit right in on the 70s cover. Bonestell was definitely popular at the time, but it's hard to overstate his legacy in the decades since. So many big names that I talked to or read about are constantly citing Chesley Bonestell. The next generation of sci-fi artists really drew inspiration from his beautiful planetary landscapes like this one here when they're creating their own era of sci-fi art, which we're almost to. But there's one last element that had to come together before the 70s sci-fi book cover art era, and that's the 50s and 60s sci-fi book cover art era. Paperbacks had existed in the US and the UK since the 30s, and growth of the medium had been steady. But in 1952, Ian and Betty Ballantyne at the publisher Ballantine Books kickstarted the science fiction paperback. The Ballantynes saw paperbacks and sci-fi as a perfect fit for a few different reasons that all boil down to introducing new and innovative ideas. On the practical side, paperbacks were a new form of cheap, disposable entertainment. And like I said before, science fiction hadn't really been used in novels. So if you have to sell people on the idea that books can be cheap now, you might as well sell them on the idea that science fiction can be novels now. But on a more conceptual sense, science fiction as a genre itself is forward-looking, and it's thinking about the future, just like the invention of the paperback. As Ian put it, we took an interest in writers who were writing about what was going to happen next. Obviously, that meant science fiction and fantasy. So paperbacks were new, science fiction novels were new. It naturally followed that the art on the covers needed to be new. Pulpy adventure art was the only art category that really said science fiction up until 1952, but they didn't want to be what science fiction had always been. They were different. Instead, Ballantine Books picked a young, new artist with a uniquely surrealist vision, Richard Powers. Powers' cover is complex and non-representational. It evokes the story within, but it kind of challenges the viewer to interpret it, to put some work in. So you might see nebulous, blobby amoebae, and it could call to mind biological life. Angular spires or spikes might invoke mechanical threats. This 1953 Richard Powers cover for Arthur C. Clarke's Childhood's End was a breakout hit, and it helped to kick off the surrealism trend. Here's two more examples. These are two examples of a surrealist visual trope that Powers used fairly often. The mannequin, a slightly warped, shadowy version of a human figure. Richard Powers was a bit of a prankster. When he was elected to the Society of Illustrators in 1958, he submitted a bio that was just kind of making fun of the process. He referred to himself as a card-carrying member, Flat Earth Association. And I skipped a slide. As his profile grew throughout the 60s, that same chaotic sense of humor got even weirder. He invented a fictional art collective to satirize the pop art movement. He signed some covers Laz/org in reference to it. You can still find this bizarre signature on dozens of secondhand paperbacks today. It's a fun Easter egg to look out for next time you're in a secondhand bookstore. By the end of the 50s, mass-produced paperbacks had surpassed the magazine when it came to science fiction. Many other publishers hopped on the bandwagon that Richard Powers popularized, and they opted for surrealist covers during this time. Avon worked with Don Ivan Punchatz, who had a high concept, often intentionally primitive, almost 2D style, which you can see here. He also really loved unsettling, kind of disturbing subject matter, like that field of mouths there. It's pretty freaky stuff. Ace Books had the upscale science fiction specials line, which often used the artist power couple, Leo and Diane Dillon. These two artists practically always worked together on the same piece of art. They would take turns and they would use bold line work so that they could more easily pick up where the other one had left off. They said that this process wound up creating better art than either one could do alone, and they called this the third artist. The Dillons were very detailed, innovative. They combined magic realism with surrealism, and they modeled their paintings after a lot of mediums, including woodcuts and stained glass. The surrealism trend at this time dovetailed with the darker, challenging work of new wave science fiction authors, as well as the psychedelia and pop art collages of 60s culture in general. The surrealism movement even pulled in established artists. Jack Gaughan had worked in representational pulp magazine illustrations since the late 1940s, yet he started adding surrealist elements to his covers. This 1957 cover in the middle here is one example of a pretty representational work. The other two covers are more abstracted, especially that one on the left is probably one of his most abstract works. He would later claim that his early 70s purchase of a pair of reading glasses ushered him out of his impressionistic period. But the reality is he was following the market. The surrealistic movement was too weird to last. In the late 60s, science fiction sales were dipping, while at the same time, the larger paperback industry was growing. It grew so much that there was now real money at stake, and so this led to a changing of the guard. The more experimental art directors began to cede some creative control to publishers and editors. And so we finally arrived in the 70s. In 1971, Donald A. Wollheim left Ace Books to start Daw Books, and Lester and Judy Lynn Del Rey started the Del Rey imprint within Ballantine. Both of these influential editors pushed for bright colors and heavily narrative art that would clearly represent spaceships or landscapes. It was a clean break from surrealism, which they saw as responsible for the dip in sales. That's a little too reductive, and I go into more detail about the shift in Worlds Beyond Time, but it didn't matter. All the other US and UK publishers followed suit, and a new cover trend was established. This was a trend that used the flashy tropes of pulp magazines, and they paired them with the realism of Chesley Bonestell, and often still called back to the spirit of surrealism at the same time. All these elements would shape the golden age of science fiction book cover art across the 70s and right into the 80s. That's what I explore in Worlds Beyond Time. I wrote in Worlds Beyond Time that the book is kind of a manifesto of my love for this era of sci-fi art. It was the imagination and explosions of color that first drew me in. And after having submerged myself in this era for so long, it feels to me like the pinnacle of artistic achievement. I have heard some good things about the Renaissance. So you can imagine it was amazing to meet and talk to some of the great artists of the era and to dig into the archives of those that are no longer with us. I tried to really respect the work of these artists, and give them the time in the sun again. There are some pieces in Worlds Beyond Time that are being published for the very first time. Some of them I had restored just for this republication. Several artists featured here have unfortunately never had dedicated art collections published. And so I feel like they absolutely deserve that attention. So I'm trying to do them some justice in this part. So for this section, we'll go through a handful of the biggest names. We'll talk about what made them unique. There's a real variety of styles here, so that's kind of tough to do, but you'll notice some repeating elements, like spaceships and machinery, as well as planets and alien landscapes. These are some of the biggest tropes that you'll see reoccurring, along with space cats. There's some more space cats. Two of the biggest names were Chris Foss and John Berkey. Both of these artists reached such a level of fame that publishers would just tell agents to find them an artist like Foss or like Berkey, but cheaper. This created a bunch of artists who mimicked their styles. Chris Foss art is colorful, grimy, and aggressively industrial with a focus on stuff like mechanical spaceships or claw-like junkyard robots or sort of brutalist boxy buildings on alien planets. His career spans over 1,000 covers. He might not have single-handedly gotten rid of those simple rocket ships that you'd see in the 40s and 50s, but he undoubtedly led the charge towards city industrial strength sci-fi realism. Look at that cool rolling spaceship. He's from the UK, and he spent time in Dorset when he was young, near the outbuildings of a local airfield where he would see army trucks or artillery pieces. You put all that weather-worn machinery right into outer space, throw in a lot of color, you have his art career. Here are a couple more great pieces. Foss loves adding weird markings to his spaceships. He'll sometimes go with stripes or checkerboard patterns like the one on the left here. But he would also add kind of arcane marks and sigils like the one on the right. These markings don't really mean anything, but they look like they do. Foss embraced entropy as well as industry, even depicting the massive junkyards that the spaceships inevitably occupy when they go belly up. You can see a few here. These are a couple of Foss-inspired artists. Colin Hay on the left and Peter Elson on the right. You can see the kind of decrepit spaceship look for the Colin Hay, along with two, what I assume are just corpses floating in space there with the spaceship. And then again, those arcane markings on both of them, really. Very clear on the Peter Elson spaceship. John Berkey is also known for spaceships, but his work is more about vibes than it is about detail. Berkey used Impressionism to craft a warmer, more lived-in image of the future than photorealism could provide. Here are a couple examples. You can kind of stare at these spaceships for a long time and still not fully understand what you're seeing. He's like the Claude Monet of sci-fi. That one on the right even looks like a lily pad. But Berkey's kind of hard to sum up because he also dipped into naturalism with clearly delineated hatches and antennae, even if the paint strokes are still visible. Here's an example of that, 1983 Discovery magazine illustration that shows off the harsh lighting that was one of his trademarks. Here's his 1974 cover to The Undefeated. This is another example of the naturalism, less impressionism. This broad range kind of makes him hard to pin down, even though there's really this sense of visual continuity. You can always tell when you're looking at John Berkey. This is not John Berkey, this is Don Mates. When I talked to this artist for my book, Don Mates told me that his agent had actually directly told him to copy Berkey's style for this piece of art, the 1982 paperback cover art for Lucky Star and the Oceans of Venus. This is because Berkey had already done covers for earlier titles in the series, so the publisher wanted something similar. Foss and Berkey were massive, but there were a lot of other artists who were also very well known, and they offered totally distinct styles. Paul Lehrer is a great example. This is a distinctive Paul Lehrer landscape, one of my favorites. You can see the bulbous cityscape there on the horizon. Paul Lehrer loves bulbous cities. He loves them. He's also got some impossible physics going on here. He has about 6 planets just hovering above the landscape, very close to the ground with an atmosphere. They're inside the atmosphere. There's clouds around them. It's sort of an impossible dreamscape feel to it. And on this particular image, you can kind of tell he used less durable paint for the pink and green planets. It's kind of chipping off, which is kind of sad. Lehrer broke into the business with this 1958 cover. It's a spaceship from his art school portfolio that he had painted using a ping pong ball on top of a toilet paper tube as a reference model. He quickly moved on from the somber gray colors that you see here, though. Publishers, starting in 1971, wanted something eye-catching, so they were pushing for bold, bright color. This kind of became as close to a unifying trait of 70s sci-fi cover art as you can get, these bright, saturated colors. Like this is a great example. But at the same time, publishers didn't always know what they really wanted. Lehrer embraced the influence of Richard Powers, and he managed to incorporate elements of surrealism, despite how it had kind of sort of fallen out of favor in the industry. This general effect of mixing surrealism with representational style is that dreamlike quality I was talking about earlier. Common recurring visuals on the Lehrer cover include tiny crowds of people centering around a single object, like a building in these cases, or a monster, or an entire city, or in this case, a sort of iPhone-looking monolith. Lair kept painting until his death in 1998. This is one of his final works, remains unfinished. Dean Ellis, I would describe as a master of paperback art. Paperback artists faced a very specific challenge. The cover image needed to be so simple that a potential reader will instantly spot it from across a grocery store aisle. But at the same time, it needs to be detailed and realistic enough that the same reader is going to find it rewarding to pick up and study closer, ideally after paying for it. A cover artist has to be simple, yet complex. The art all needs to fit onto the standard 4x7-inch paperback cover. Dean Ellis was a master at this stuff. His covers often center around one easy-to-parse element, a crisply colored building or a spaceship. This one on the left here, you can see even the shape of the spaceship is a triangle. That helps it stand out. Another one of Ellis's visual tics is the stylized figure of a man half-formed from multicolored circuitry. Here's two examples, and here are two more examples, including a Mr. Bean lookalike on the right. Dean Ellis really loved returning to this theme, possibly because it was an easy way to signal that a story was science fiction, since circuitry says computers, says technology. But he pulled a version of this trick back in 1967 for my favorite cover to Ray Bradbury's The Illustrated Man. The man on this cover has intricate tattoos, not circuits, but the effect is similar. And it's spookier in this case because the figure is turned away, it's unknowable, it's meditating cross-legged in front of this blood-red sky. Readers must have thought this was a great cover too, because Bantam Books kept it for years and years, across 30 print runs of the title. The version here has been restored for my book. Ellis's ability to include clarity and detail kept helping him out across his career. After he stopped doing sci-fi paperbacks, he had a long relationship painting stamps for the US Postal Service. Hard to get tinier and more detailed than stamps. So we've already seen Chesley Bonestell as an example of space art. That is, realistic scientific illustrations of outer space or potential futures as opposed to fictional futures. Some artists in the 70s would switch between science fiction and realistic space art. And David A. Hardy is a great example of one of the best. I describe him as a very precise and scientifically literate space artist, and he's arguably more precise than the space art itself. Science is always marching on, and that means some details of space art are sure to become outdated. Hardy's always quick to point this out when it happens. He's even gone so far as to repaint some of his works to make them more accurate to the real world. It's honestly a bit of a losing battle, but I respect him for it. Here's one depicting snow on Enceladus, a moon of Saturn. Very reminiscent of the types of scenes Chesley Bonestell would paint. Here's one showing the distant star Zeta Erugae as seen from an orbiting planet on the left, and then on the right there's an interstellar communications array. He's a very hard worker. His career began with a space illustration he did for his hometown newspaper when he was 16. And his art has since appeared in magazines, on TV shows, advertisements, albums, even paperweights. He's worked in so many mediums with so many types of technology. He's easily one of the top space artists working today. All that work includes a solid career in sci-fi illustration as well. He's created album art for the rock band Hawkwind. You can see back cover to a 74 album on the left there. And he's done a lengthy series of magazine covers for the magazine of fantasy and science fiction. He's also had some interesting near misses. Stanley Kubrick considered but passed on using his work for 2001: A Space Odyssey. Hardy actually found out years later that Kubrick had only seen black and white photocopies of his portfolio rather than the original. Pink Floyd also considered but passed on using his art for the Dark Side of the Moon album cover. This is Hardy's work for that shown here. It's hard to talk about sci-fi paperbacks without also covering fantasy paperbacks. They weren't a recognized marketing category until a little while after sci-fi books. Fantasy broke out in the mid-60s with two different hugely popular book series. The 1965 paperback release of The Lord of the Rings, seen here with beautiful Barbara Remington triptych, and the 1967 launch of Lancer Books' Frank Frazetta illustrated Conan reprint. Fantasy novel cover art tends to focus on human or humanoid figures a little more than science fiction. Michael Whelan is one standout artist who does both genres, but a little more fantasy. He's amazing at symbolism. He puts in way more effort on symbolism than pretty much any other cover artist. Here, I'll use this cover to show you what I mean. This is Joan D. Vinge's 1988 novel Cat's Paw, featuring the telepathic main character Cat, pictured here. Cat uses a drug to heighten his mind-reading abilities, and it's delivered through a patch behind his ear. So Michael Whelan chose to paint a scene where Cat's nervously touching his patch, just like he does in the book, but the move that he picked makes it look like Cat's kind of cocking his ear in order to actually listen to someone. So there's both a literal meaning and a metaphorical meaning. On top of all that, Cat's also stepping out of darkness into light, which is another metaphor for how in the book Cat feels torn between two worlds, the world of seedy criminals and the world of the wealthy elite. So there's a lot going on a Whelan cover, is what I'm trying to say. Whelan's one of the most decorated speculative fiction artists ever. He has 13 Best Professional Artist Hugo Awards. His work is very character-driven and lets the personalities shine through in stuff like poses, anatomy, texture. He's given this figure a really resolute stance on this 1983 cover to Foundation's Edge. Here's his 1989 Martian Chronicles cover. Has another example of subtext. There's a human spaceship in the sky, and it has this ominously downward arcing contrail. When they land, the humans are going to throw off the natural balance of the planet. Whelan's even capable of adding symbolism subconsciously. This is his 1986 cover to Isaac Asimov's Foundation. The cooling towers there in the background are very reminiscent of mushroom clouds from a bomb, but he only realized this after he finished painting it. There are a lot of great artists to cover too. Tim White's a great example of the exact cover art style that's popular in the 70s and 80s. His work has fine detail, has bold colors. It depicts fascinating landscapes. One visual trope he often used was see-through spaceship cockpits, like that one on the left there. Here's Bruce Pennington, amazing artist. He has a great old school style that lets you really see the brush strokes. He's very versatile. He does just absolute classic depictions of animals, aliens, vehicles, environments. He loves UFOs. You can see them here. When I was writing my book, I actually had a hard time figuring out which chapter to put him in because I divide them by themes like animals or vehicles, and he's great at all of them. So it's hard to put him in there somewhere. Here's Jeffrey Catherine Jones, who has a beautiful painterly style. Common tropes include graceful figures, minimal atmospheric backgrounds, and muted colors. And yes, that is a space cat on the right with its own little space-equipped kitty carrier. I could keep listing artists forever, but let's talk about the impact that this decade of cover art has had on pop culture, both during the 70s and every decade since. I mentioned earlier that I can see 70s sci-fi art's influence everywhere, and in this section, you'll be able to see it too. George Lucas is probably the biggest 70s sci-fi superfan. Star Wars is famously influenced by samurai movies and World War II dogfights, but it's less famously very deeply inspired by sci-fi paperbacks and comic books. Lucas commissioned John Berkey to do official Death Star artwork, like this 1977 poster, which was included with the soundtrack album. You can see on the right there, there's like multiple Millennium Falcons because John Berkey did not watch the movie and still hasn't seen it, I believe. He said, like he passed away in 2008, but he'd mentioned like just a few years earlier, he still hadn't seen it. So I don't think he got around. But Berkey's influence still went even deeper than that, though. Lucas had actually already bought existing artwork from John Berkey in 1975, and he used it as visual references for Star Wars. This 1972 Berkey cover was for an anthology called Star Science Fiction Stories #4, and it really seems to have inspired the Death Star. Other artists might have inspired Lucas as well. Here's David A. Hardy artwork. This is from 1974, features a metal planet, years before the first Star Wars movie. Lucas has also cited Frank Frazetta's 1952 cover for Famous Funnies as an inspiration for Chewbacca. And you can kind of see it in this cover. The guy's kind of fuzzy, kind of lanky. But there's another much more clear inspiration as well. On the left here, we have John Schoenherr's 1975 interior artwork for Analog magazine. And then on the right, Ralph McQuarrie's concept for Chewbacca. The only major addition is a bandolier. Schoenherr never got a cent for his work there. So. Here's another example of inspiration in Star Wars. Sid Mead's 1969 design for U.S. Steel led directly to the Empire Strikes Back AT-AT walkers. Art director Joe Johnston explained in 2010, the snow walkers were from a brochure by Sid Mead for U.S. Steel of those walking trucks going through the snow. We turned them into walking tanks. Star Wars wasn't the only famous 70s sci-fi movie that was influenced by the cover artists we've discussed today. Here's the Nostromo, a spaceship in Ridley Scott's 1979 film Alien, and it is partially based off of Chris Foss concept art. Foss did work for the film, and Chris Foss's industrialized style is just naturally a great fit for that movie. Foss did a lot of concept work for film during that period. He also worked on the 1978 Superman, the 1980 Flash Gordon, the 1984 Dune. But his influence is at its most obvious in more recent 70s and 80s throwback films and TV. The director James Gunn included Foss art in his pitch for the first Guardians of the Galaxy, which then hired Foss as a consultant. James Gunn has stated that this sci-fi dune buggy trundling through yellow alien liquid was the single most inspirational Foss work. You can see a scene from Guardians of the Galaxy there where Drax is falling into some yellow liquid that looks pretty similar. Chris Foss's work reappeared in Thor Ragnarok, and you've got those colorful, interesting markings on the spaceships again. Then Netflix made the 2018 Choose Your Own Adventure style special Bandersnatch, and it needed a cover for its fictional 80s era sci-fi novel. Once again, Chris Foss was the go-to artist. Some scenes from the 2009 film Avatar closely resemble artworks by Roger Dean. I don't think I can legally say they ripped them off, but you can look at those pictures and make your own mind up. When John Schoenherr wasn't creating Chewbacca, he was famous for his Dune illustrations. The series author Frank Herbert loved Schoenherr, describing him as the only man who has ever visited Dune. And the 2021 Dune movie homages Schoenherr's illustrations multiple times. These are just two examples here. I really like this because it's such an interesting example of the ways that decades-old artwork can reappear in some form in a big blockbuster without anyone in the audience really realizing it. Video games are another huge way that the designs and colors of 70s sci-fi art continue to live today. An example here on the left is a 1970 Dean Ellis Ringworld illustration, and on the right is a Halo scene that's pretty reminiscent. Plenty of artists in my book that I haven't had time to discuss today pivoted to video game concept art in the 90s or 2000s. Douglas Chaffee, Fred Gambino, plenty of others. Video games also love to revisit concepts that were popularized but not invented by older science fiction stories. Halo uses a concept of a massive ancient space station that generates artificial gravity through centrifugal force, just like the one featured in the book Ringworld. On the left here, or on the right here is a Halo scene, and on the left is a Stephen Vincent Johnson illustration from 1979. The 1999 strategy game Homeworld was so inspired by the artist Peter Elson that it actually named a space captain inside the game after him. And then the creators of the 2016 procedurally generated game No Man's Sky said they wanted it to look like a science fiction book cover come to life, and they have specifically mentioned Chris Foss and Ralph McQuarrie as inspirations. But this presentation just scratched the surface. There are plenty of artists and concepts that I go into much more detail in Worlds Beyond Time. I talk about stuff like skull planets or mysterious alien emperors, psychedelic comic strips, or one of my favorites, dolphins in spacesuits. Talk about interstellar rivers and space elevators. It's more of those tiny little guys. And of course, we can't forget space cats. Look at that. This one has 6 legs and horns and looks like a perfectly normal cat. I think I get along with it. But that's it for my presentation. Guess I'll stop sharing.
Love the Wayne Barlow space cat as a closer. The most Wayne Barlow cat ever.
Yeah, I love Wayne Barlow. He's so great with alien biology designs. It's so difficult to get 6 legs on a cat to actually look like they all work.
Yeah. No, he's fantastic. We do have some questions in the Q&A if people want to still send them in. It's not too late. I do have a question of my own, though. We'll get to audience questions in a second, but I think this is a fun jumping off point. But how did you decide what goes in the final edit? Because obviously, like, this presentation barely scratches the surface of what's in the book, and the book itself is like scratching the surface of sci-fi art in the 70s. So how did you make those calls?
It was hard. It's really hard. I kind of just looked at who are the absolute biggest artists and what does their particular style kind of contribute to that art from the 70s. So you've got John Berkey and Chris Foss have spaceships, and spaceships are huge, and they're huge, so it made sense to start with them. And then I just had to throw in, Tim White and Bruce Pennington, just like with just one slide each, which is a real shame. They're so great. They easily could have had their own section, and I just didn't have the time.
A question from Chris, who's asking if you recall the first work that drew you to 70s sci-fi art.
Yeah, I was first got interested in it back in 2013. I was in college, just procrastinating on doing my finals, and I just found a piece of art on the internet that was uncredited from like 1977, and it was kind of a wizard-looking figure on a giant mushroom in an alien landscape that was like mostly mushrooms. And I was like, this stuff's so cool. I love the colors. I want to just like follow some Tumblr or Twitter account or something that just has nothing but this art. And I poked around and couldn't find one. And so I just wound up creating my own and started researching from there, and kind of slowly learned more about who the actual artists were and how it all worked from there.
Mm-hmm. You've got to create what you want to see in the world.
Yeah, exactly.
Who was, out of curiosity, who was the artist? Who did that?
Still uncredited. It was just a random artwork. It was posted on Reddit. The guy who posted it was like, had some story like, my father met a soldier in Germany who handed him this, or it was from 1977. And that's like all the information I've ever learned about it. So
that feels like a visitation of fate to me. Like,
yeah.
Nick is asking, as far as I know, many earlier SF stories lean towards hard science fiction, their authors working in the sciences themselves. You mentioned the impossible physics of many of these artworks. And do you know of or have any stories of author reactions to the artwork attached to their stories, positive or negative, or even just bemused?
Yeah, that's really interesting.
Like if you're looking at a Richard Powers cover and you wrote like the hardest, like an Arthur C. Clarke story, and you get like a massive eyeballs, like what?
Yeah.
What are you thinking at that point?
I bet there are some stories out there about artists who were kind of shocked by Richard Powers' style, or authors. But the one story that does come to mind is one about Vincent de Fate, another great artist and art historian who wrote my foreword. But he did illustration for an Isaac Asimov book, and he was going to do the spaceship and realized after reading the description that was in the book itself that if he'd actually depicted it that way, it just would have looked like a giant trash can in space. And so he was like, I'll go with something cooler. And then he later heard back from his publisher. It was like, Isaac Asimov was like, yes, you made the right decision. It would have looked terrible. So Asimov at least was happy with some artistic license being taken. Not sure about, I'm sure that wasn't universal. I'm sure you got a whole range of responses.
No, I can see somebody like Arthur C. Clarke going, no, it has to be a trash can.
Yeah, must follow the specifications.
Yeah. Cliff is asking, can you speak to the differences between US and UK paperback covers?
Yeah, that's interesting. In a lot of cases, the more popular artists would sell the secondary rights in the other market. So there was a lot of visual continuity between the US and the UK, I would say. There are definitely artists who are more well-known some places than in others. I've talked to my UK friends. I like to ask people if they know any artist or art style. And I usually get Frank Frazetta in the US, and then I've gotten Rodney Matthews one time in the UK. I'm not sure if Rodney Matthews is as big over here in the US, but that is his giant ship that is sailing on the interstellar river at the end of my presentation. So I do have some of his art in that presentation I just gave. But yeah, a lot of visual similarity. I feel like the UK and US publishers kind of felt that the same things would sell the same, would sell books. So they liked details, representational work, they liked color. So kind of similar markets.
Yeah, I think they tend to be in lockstep, at least in this period. I don't know about now. I know I've seen some different covers in Europe than exist here, but that's present day. That's not the 70s. Yeah. I lost the question that I liked that I wanted to pull up next. Bill is asking, can you say more about the 70s swing to illustrating scenes away from surreal or abstract art? Associated with Del Rey books, but you hinted at a more nuanced view.
Yeah, my understanding of it is that the industry tended to follow, in marketing, you always want something that's relatively fresh. And so you eventually just need to shift from whatever you had before, even if it was perfectly fine. And so that's kind of what happened to surrealism. It was so successful that after 10 years, 15 years, publishers start being like, well, we kind of need something that doesn't say 15 years ago. And so that color, detail, representational spaceship stuff, the charge was kind of led with DAW books and some more really opinionated editors, and then everyone else followed more or less. With all these things, there's always there's lots of surrealist artists who kept getting work, and it's hard to draw really definitive boundaries. So I guess that's the nuanced take, is that it's hard to say. Not very satisfying, but
yeah, I mean, it happens. You see it, with current cover designs swinging away from the more illustraty type stuff of the 90s and early 2000s. So
I mean, modern covers still doing sort of the Instagram type,
the cursive brush calligraphy over the
or
illustrated. Oh yeah,
something that kind of puts the title first. I mean, my book cover does that, so
yeah.
There's still
once more, I have lost the question I was looking for. Ulf is curious about the actual creation of the book, from the idea to the finished product. How was it working with Abrams, interviewing artists, looking into archives, having Vincent DeFate writing the foreword?
Yeah, It was a long process. I sold the pitch towards the end of 2019. So it's been about 5 years. Got started.
I remember talking to you about that at the time.
Yeah. I was like, you'll see this art book in just 2 years, right? No, it took way longer. Every stage of the process was just really difficult for me to kind of progress through. But I think, it was my first art book. And so if I'd kind of like had more experience, I think I would have changed up how I approached it. What I did was I kind of went with, what would my dream version of this book be? And I wrote the entire thing being like, I'll just get all the art I want. And only then did I start the process for getting the art. And if you're doing an art collection like this, you should do the two of them kind of together at the same time. And like each one kind of feeds off the other a little bit and is affected by which types of art pieces you can get. So I wound up having to do one fairly big rewrite where I cut 15 two-page spreads and added 15 others, and shuffled some art around. Yeah, so long process. It was great to get to talk to artists. Some really nice interactions. Angus McKee was really hard to track down, but he was very nice when I actually talked to him. So
please tell me he was like living in a hut in a forest somewhere or something like
honestly, that. I only emailed, so I say talk, it was email. But he has no social media presence. He had a website, but it like has been defunct for like a decade. So I can only assume he's in tune with nature, living his best life somewhere.
He's free. He's happy. He's gotten away from it all.
Yeah.
Let's go negative for a second, because I'm really curious about this. Dragon Roast is asking, are there any common elements or themes of 70s sci-fi art or other paperback eras, if you'd like, that you don't like or are critical of? I was kind of wondering this myself, actually.
Yeah, it's I guess I'd have to think about it. For the most part, I like ever so often I'll like find some art that I don't like as much as other art. But I usually just kind of post it all on my, Tumblr, Twitter. But
post it and let God sort them out.
Yeah, I'm like, if it's 70s, fits my audience.
Yeah.
I say I curate stuff. I don't really curate it. It's all go now.
Yeah. Bill is asking, who are the less seen artists that you tried to uplift in the book? Guessing based on Twitter, Mike Hinge, Don Puncats, Jerome Podwell.
Yeah. I'd say Don Ivan Punchatz is pretty well known now. Not that he doesn't deserve it. He's great. But who was that first name you mentioned?
Mike Hinge.
Mike Hinge, yeah, definitely could stand to be a lot more well known in my opinion. He did have like some covers for Time magazine and like he got work, but he was a pretty really kept himself. And so let me see. Dean Ellis has never had a dedicated art collection. I think he really should have one for his science fiction work alone. Actually, I didn't get to put this in the presentation, but have you seen the show Severance on Apple? It's great.
I haven't, but I'm sure people who are watching have.
They kind of modeled the style and look of the company that everyone works for in that show after the same company that Dean Ellis did some advertisements for with like the very similar style in the late 60s. So there's another influence that I wasn't able to get in there. But Dean Ellis, and then two other huge names who I don't believe have ever had their dedicated art collections are Paul Lair and John Schoener. So, and I wouldn't call either of those under-recognized, but having your own dedicated art collection really helps kind of get your name out there, helps people really remember you. So I think they should have those too.
Mm-hmm. I think we're coming up on 4 o'clock. Are we supposed to be winding this up now?
I don't know. Should we do like one more question?
One more question?
Yeah, there's time for, I think, 2 more questions.
Okay. How to narrow it down? God. Tim is asking, professional focus is on early cyberspace, as this is often spatially represented. Can you refer to any works or pieces of art that implement or depict things like a mind space or a data landscape?
Like a
representation of cyberspace, I think, is the kind of
interesting. You know, those tended to be a bit more popular in like the 80s, 90s, when they were kind of the personal computer only started coming out and being used by people in like 1975, and then was kind of computers were, the idea of having a personal computer was kind of still pretty new in the 80s. So I think like the absolute best work would be kind of a little outside of the area I studied for this book. It is really interesting field though. I did kind of touch on it with the Dean Ellis circuitry. Yeah, nothing immediately comes to mind.
Worth a shot. And last question. I'm curious about what's next for you, like now that you've put this out in the world.
Man, I don't know. I would love to do more art books. I really love working on them. I have some ideas, but I also am doing a email newsletter that is kind of carrying on with very similar entries about 70s sci-fi art that I have in my book. It's free as well, so if you want to look that up, Google my name, find me online, find my newsletter. It's on ghost.org, I think. It's the host for the newsletter. But yeah, if you really love the book, you'll love the newsletter.
Sweet. Well, that's a great plug to finish off with. Go get subscribe to Adam's newsletter. If you're in the Seattle area too, you can subscribe to Third Place Books newsletter over at thirdplacebooks.com. Go check out the rest of our event series. Adam, Jared, this has been a wonderful conversation. To those of you listening this afternoon, I hope you all enjoyed it. Again, this recording will be available online later. Please go check out Worlds Beyond Time. We have copies here at Third Place Books, and I'm sure your independent bookstore does too. Other than that, any last words before we head out for the day?
Thank you so much for having me and hosting me. Love you, Third Place Books.
That's awesome. Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Jared, and thank you, Adam. And have a great evening, and please be well.